of the work we are going to talk about today is George Alexander Kennedy, an important scholar on the history of rhetoric.
Yes, Kennedy is a really important scholar, and his work is one of the foundational works in the field. And the book we're going to talk about today is actually the first in a series of books on rhetoric, The Art of Persuasion in Greece.
This book is followed by The Art of Rhetoric in the Roman World, and Greek Rhetoric under Christian emperors, in which he evaluates rhetorical studies in the Middle Ages.
Yes, but he reviews his work on the history of classical rhetoric in his book, A New History of Classical Rhetoric.
If we go back to our book, in Athens of the 4th century BC, in the world of sophists and philosophers.
Yes, a world where oral culture prevailed. A world where the most heated philosophical debates on truth were held in the agora. A period when the word was the rule.
All right, picture this. A world where being a great speaker wasn't just, a nice skill to have. It was the absolute backbone of everything. Education, law, even how people figured out what was true.
Right? The core.
That's the world of ancient Greek rhetoric. And trust me, it still shapes how we communicate today in ways you might not expect.
Absolutely.
Today, we're diving deep into the fascinating world of ancient Greek rhetoric and the profound, the influence of this office.
Yes, a huge topic.
Our goal is to trace its evolution, meet some of its pivotal figures, and truly understand its lasting imprint on everything from courtroom debates to political speech.
And we've got some great source material to draw on for this.
We have indeed. We've pulled from a rich stack including antique rhetoric of a sophist and George Kennedy's comprehensive The Art of Persuasion in Greece.
So the aim is to give you a clear, compelling understanding of how persuasion really became an art form back then.
Okay, let's dig into this then. If we step back into ancient Greece, say the 5th and 4th centuries BC, we see a society where the spoken word was just absolutely everything.
Totally dominant.
Even when people started reading and writing, it was still often described as difficult, kind of unnatural even.
Yeah, not like speaking.
So in this very vocal culture, how did the art of persuasion rhetoric first emerge? Where did it actually begin? Well,
what's truly fascinating here is that its beginnings were incredibly grounded, really practical. The tradition, and this is recounted by many ancient writers, points to Syracuse in Sicily around the second quarter of the 5th century BC.
Sicily. Interesting. Why there?
Well, after these tyrants were overthrown, there was suddenly this massive wave of lawsuits. People trying to reclaim property, settle old scores. Chaos, basically.
Right? The real need.
Exactly. And into this chaos stepped Corax and Theseus. Now these guys weren't theorists dreaming of abstract ideas in an ivory tower.
No,
they developed very practical techniques for judicial rhetoric specifically to teach regular citizens, people who just weren't used to speaking in public. It was a direct response to a very urgent need. How do you win your case in court when you have to argue it yourself?
that makes so much sense. Necessity truly is the mother of invention.
It really is.
And then it seems this powerful tool, this rhetoric, it made its way to Athens. I'm thinking of the famous sophist.
Gorgeous.
And apparently brought it to Athens in 427 BC during an embassy from Leontini. It sounds like rhetoric really sort of blossomed there, becoming part of that whole sophistic movement.
Absolutely. And if we zoom out a bit, sophistry itself was a very practical philosophy. It was focused on teaching people skills for civic life, and rhetoric was undeniably at its core.
So it wasn't just an add-on.
Not at all. The sophists saw themselves as training future statesmen, right? Not just abstract thinkers. And their ideas about truth and argument were often shaped by what they observed happening in the Greek city-states, especially the dynamics of the law courts.
Okay.
And this leads to an interesting point. While the sophists certainly championed rhetoric, pushed it forward, historical accounts suggest rhetoric was actually the older, more fundamental force. In many ways, sophistry itself kind of evolved as a product of rhetoric's influence, rather than the other way around.
That flips the script a bit. So rhetoric wasn't just about, beautiful, flowery speeches then?
No, much more fundamental.
It was about something deeper, a shift in how people thought about argument itself. It sounds like there were, what, 4 distinct signals, almost like checkpoints, that marked the real awakening of rhetorical consciousness in Greece.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah, 4 key shifts. And you're right, it's not just about flash.
So what was the first one?
The first sign was a new kind of rationalism, a focus on proofs and arguments. Writers in the 5th century BC absolutely reveled in what you might call the gymnastics of argument.
Gymnastics of argument. I like that.
Yeah, they focused on proving if an action was, say, expedient, or just, or possible, or honorable. And central to all this was the concept of probability.
Probability. Okay,
Plato himself noted how Theseus and Gorgias realized that probabilities could actually be more honored than the actual truth, especially if the truth seemed, well, unlikely.
wow. So spin isn't exactly new then?
You could say that. I mean, imagine in Sophocles' Epis, the king Creon uses probability to argue he has no motive to usurp Epis. It's a classic example. And this argument from probability was incredibly powerful. Why? Because unlike witnesses who you know could be bribed or mistaken, probabilities could not be bought. They seemed objective. Later, Aristotle would take this foundational idea and develop it into a whole system using the antinomy. The rhetorical syllogism, basically an argument based on what's true for the most part, not absolute certainty, and also the example, which is essentially rhetorical induction.
It's incredible. You can really hear the foundations of our modern legal system in that this idea that everyone, even someone who seems obviously guilty, gets to present their case based on what's probable.
Exactly that fundamental right.
Beyond when they argue, the probability stuff, how did they structure these speeches to be so effective? What was the second sign?
That's the second key, Mark. The development of a structured arrangement for speeches, a kind of blueprint. Early handbooks, from Corax right up to Aristotle, primarily focused on the judicial speech. The courtroom speech
Makes sense given the origins, right?
and they break it down into standard parts. Think of it like a template.
Yeah,
You had the proemium, that's the introduction, then the narration, where you lay out the facts of the case, then the proof, the core arguments, and finally the epilogue, the conclusion.
premium narration, proof, epilogue.
Okay, this strong judicial focus reflects a practical reality. Greek law often required citizens to speak for themselves in their own defense.
So there was a market for this instruction.
Huge demand. And since studying with the top sophists could be pretty expensive, we see figures like Lysias emerging. He was a logographos, essentially a professional speechwriter.
A speechwriter for hire.
Exactly. Selling custom speeches to litigants, he was providing a crucial service for people who couldn't afford that intensive, expensive training themselves.
That's fascinating. A speech for hire service back in ancient Greece. So we've got rational arguments, a clear structure. What about the third sign? You mentioned the new prose styles. What made them so distinctive?
Style. This was a huge leap. It's where rhetoric really starts to feel like an art.
How so?
Well, we find descriptions of at least 3 major styles developing. Take Gorgias' style, for example. He wasn't afraid to borrow tricks from poetry.
Like what?
He pushed antithesis. That's a balanced contrast of words or ideas to an extreme. Think like, not that I loved Caesar less, but that I loved Rome more. That kind of balance. And he became famous for what are called Gorgianic figures, like Isocrates and a homeotila.
Whoa, fancy terms? What are those?
They're just names for specific patterns. Isocrates is having clauses of equal length, creating rhythm. Homeotuaton is using similar sounding endings, kind of like rhyme, but in prose.
So very patterned, almost musical.
Exactly. Imagine a speech where lines have a really strong, noticeable rhythm or echo each other. Even back then, people found it a bit artificial, maybe too flashy.
Conspicuous.
Right? but they were the absolute hallmarks of his style. Then you had Thrasymachus, who focused more purely on rhythmic structure. And early Antiphon also showed a strong love for that antipus, that balance.
So they were really experimenting with the sound of prose.
Totally. These styles, though, may be criticized later as a bit labored and ridiculous. They were truly pioneering attempts to create a literary prose, something distinct from just everyday talk. It reflects this Greek zest for sound, this appreciation for the musicality of language. It was about making the words themselves stick in your head, not just the ideas.
So we've gone from practical court needs to this really artistic, structured approach to language. It definitely sounds like the Sophists were the rock stars of their day, consultants for public life.
That's a pretty good description, yeah.
But how central was rhetoric specifically to their whole educational model? Was it just one skill among many, or was it like the foundation?
Oh, it was absolutely central, foundational, really. You see, formal schooling beyond the elementary level was pretty rare back then.
Right? You mentioned that.
So sophists like Protagoras, Gorgias Hippias, they filled this gap. They provided what was essentially higher education for young men preparing for public life.
And rhetoric was key to that preparation.
Absolutely critical. Isocrates, for example, another major figure, explicitly saw rhetoric as the primary tool for any kind of political activity. Even Aristotle taught it. It wasn't just a skill for them. It was pretty much the skill for navigating civic life successfully.
That really changes how you think about them. So this wasn't just about, winning debates for the sake of it. It was tied to a broader idea, almost what they considered philosophy.
Precisely. That's a key insight. Isocrates, who saw himself as following in the sophist tradition, actually used the term philosophy to describe this very practical study of rhetoric and civic virtue.
Not philosophy as we might think of it today. Maybe
not entirely. He argued that absolute certainty was, elusive, maybe impossible. So only the probable could really be known and debated.
And rhetoric was the tool for that.
Exactly. Rhetoric was the best way to present, explore, and ultimately decide on those probabilities in the real world. Gorgias felt similarly. He called rhetoric the artificer of persuasion, a kind of master art.
Artificer of persuasion.
Yeah. Dealing with all sorts of subjects, especially legal and political ones, not by claiming scientific certainty, but by skillfully using what was probable, what was convincing to an audience.
Okay, but it's hard to talk rhetoric without bringing up Plato. He was famously skeptical, right? If not outright critical.
Oh, absolutely. Plato is the great counterpoint here. So how did he engage with this rising tide of sophistic rhetoric?
His dialogue, the Phaedrus, is just fascinating on this. It's a deep dive into the whole tension. In it, he actually presents example speeches. Really?
Plato wrote speeches?
Well, he includes one attributed to Lysias, the speechwriter we mentioned, which most scholars think Plato actually wrote himself as a kind of extreme example, a parody almost of sophistic style.
Okay, to make a point.
Exactly. And alongside these examples, he gets into a much deeper theoretical discussion. Now, Plato was initially very wary, deeply concerned.
Why? What was his main issue?
He feared that rhetoric, as the Sophists taught it, only dealt with opinion, with doxa, not true knowledge epikema. And because of that, it could easily be twisted for deceptive ends to make the weaker argument appear stronger, for instance.
A classic criticism.
Right? But interestingly, later in the Phaedrus, he explores how rhetoric could be used properly ethically. He argued it required a deep psychological understanding. You had to understand human character, different types of souls, and tailor your speech to persuade them towards the good and the true. He even famously suggested that a true philosopher, someone armed with genuine knowledge, could achieve persuasion without effort.
Implying that truth itself is persuasive.
Basically, yes, that genuine understanding, properly communicated, was the ultimate persuasive force, far beyond mere technical tricks.
So it sounds like rhetoric started as this practical tool, got elevated to an art by the Sophists, And then Plato brought this heavy philosophical critique, trying to ground it in truth. But it didn't stop there, did it? It seems like it became this incredibly formalized systematic discipline later on.
That's the next big chapter. Absolutely. The development of a system.
How did that happen? What did it look like?
Well, the history of ancient rhetoric, as our sources present it, is really the growth of a single grand traditional theory. It builds over centuries. Quintilian, a Roman rhetorician writing much later, kind of summed it all up.
And how did he define it?
He defined rhetoric beautifully as benedicendi scientia,
Which means
roughly the science of speaking well. And that phrase perfectly captures both sides, the theoretical knowledge and the practical skill. Then Eddie Chandy,
the science of speaking well, and our sources break this developed theory down into 5 distinct parts like building blocks for the perfect speech.
exactly 5 core components. Now you see the beginnings of the system in earlier works like Aristotle's Rhetoric and another text called the Rhetoric ad Alexandrum. But it really saw its greatest elaboration in its most detailed breakdown during the Hellenistic. After Aristotle.
Okay, so what are the 5 parts? Right.
The 5 canons, as they're often called. First, there's invention, or inventio in Latin.
Invention, finding the argument.
Pretty much. It was all about finding your core argument, the main point of contention, what they call the stasis or status. It involved figuring out exactly what you needed to prove or refute, and then gathering all your relevant arguments. This wasn't just about hard evidence like witnesses or documents. It heavily involved probable argumentation using those epicurems or rhetorical syllogisms. We talked about arguments based on probabilities, and critically, it also involved appeals to emotion, pathos, and building your own credibility. Your
Ethos, pathos, logos would be the argument itself.
Exactly. Logos, argument, pathos, emotion, ethos, character, Aristotle's famous triad, all falling under invention. And within invention, they recognize 3 main types of speech: deliberative for politics, judicial for courts, and epideictic for ceremonies like eulogies or praise.
Got it. So invention is finding what to say.
Second is arrangement dispositio. This is simply the logical organization, how you structure the speech. They order the parts, intro, narration, proof, conclusion, maybe refutation.
Okay, logical flow makes sense.
Third is style elocutio. This is about the language itself. It focused on 4 virtues: correctness, good grammar, clarity, being easily understood, ornamentation, using figures of speech tropes, making it sound good, and propriety, using the right style for the occasion and audience.
Ornamentation like this, Gorgionic figures.
Exactly. Tropes like metaphor, simile figures like antithesis, icicle on, and styles themselves were often classified grand middle plane depending on the subject.
Okay, fourth. Fourth is memory memoria. This wasn't just rote memorization. It involved specific techniques, mnemonic devices, to help speakers recall long, complex arguments without notes.
How do they do that?
Often by associating ideas or words with physical locations in a familiar place, like rooms in a house or landmarks on a street. The method of loci Simonides of Cios is the legendary figure credited with inventing this
Memory palace.
kind of, yeah. And finally, fifth, delivery or actio. This covered everything. Nonverbal. Voice control, volume, pitch, tone, stance, posture, gestures, facial expressions, and more performance aspects.
Wow, invention, arrangement, style, memory, delivery. It really did become this incredibly formalized, almost scientific system, a complete toolkit.
A very comprehensive toolkit, yes.
So what did this mean for his role in society, especially in education? You mentioned this office, but did this formalized system become part of schooling?
Oh, absolutely. Foundational in Hellenistic times. So after Alexander the Great, rhetoric pretty much was the curriculum for what we'd call secondary education.
A whole curriculum?
Largely, yes. Boys typically around age 14 would go to a rhetoric teacher of rhetoric for theoretical instruction in these 5 parts and tons of practical exercises pro gymnosmata. And this training might continue for life, basically.
So everyone in public life would have gone through this?
Pretty much anyone who is educated for public life, yes. But this widespread acceptance of these detailed rules of art while creating systematic instruction also had an interesting, maybe double-edged effect.
How so?
Well, our sources suggest it sometimes led to a kind of ossification, a hardening.
Ossification. Like it became too rigid.
Exactly. Ancient creativity could get a bit stifled. Rhetoric became such a dominant closed system that it started to influence how people viewed life and thought itself as a kind of closed system too, where everything fits into the neat categories, perhaps discouraging truly original thinking.
The downside of too much structure, like trying to paint by numbers forever.
That's a great analogy. It limits the possibilities sometimes.
Okay, so this formal theory sounds intense, almost overwhelming. But how did all these rules, invention, arrangement, style, etc., actually manifest in the speeches of the great Attic orators? What does it sound like in practice? Can we see the theory at work?
Oh, definitely. We can see it playing out in really fascinating ways when we look at the surviving speeches.
Like who? Give us an example.
Okay, well, take Antiphon. He was active earlier in the late 5th century. He was known as a complete legal advisor, and he wrote these things called tetralogies.
Tetralogies.
Yeah, sets of 4 speeches, 2 for the prosecution, 2 for the defense, for imaginary court cases, model speeches, basically
Practice cases.
exactly. And in these, you clearly see the reliance on argument from probability that we talked about.
Right, the first marker.
And they generally follow the standard judicial speech divisions: intro, proof, conclusion. Interestingly, though, they sometimes skip the narration part. Well, one theory is they might have been written before all the Sicilian techniques like those from Coax and Lysias fully reached Athens and became standardized. But overall, Antiphon was seen as generally fair, sticking to the point, arranging his arguments pretty freely within that structure.
Okay, Antiphon, what about Lysias? You mentioned him as the master speechwriter, the logographus Lysias.
Yes, he was a true virtuoso of ethipoia.
Ethipoia.
It's the technique of skillfully weaving the speaker's character, their ethos, into the fabric of the oration itself.
Ooh, making the speaker sound believable, authentic.
Exactly. It made the speeches feel incredibly genuine, even though he wrote them for other people. It was crucial for establishing rapport with the jury, the audience.
So how did he do it?
His clients, whether they were supposed to be, say, a conservative old farmer or a witty, sarcastic, disabled man asking for his pension.
Wow, specific characters.
Oh yeah, they would always speak in this beautiful, simple, flawless Attic Greek, clear, elegant language. But they embodied totally distinct personalities through their word choices, their attitudes, the examples they used. It was brilliant. It allowed for the subtle, indirect proof through the sheer force of the speaker's presented character.
That sounds incredibly skillful, creating a voice. Okay. And then the big one. Demosthenes, the orator who stood up to Philip of Macedon, championed Athenian democracy. How did he use rhetoric?
Demosthenes is fascinating because he bridges different aspects. He actually started his career, like Lucius, as a logographus, writing speeches for others in private lawsuits.
Okay, learned the trade.
Definitely. But then he became the leading political orator of his time, and you see a shift in his work. He moves beyond just focusing on legal technicalities to concentrating on much wider, more profound issues, especially things like loyalty to Athenian democratic traditions, the dangers facing the city. You see this incredibly powerfully in his famous speech on the crown.
Right, defending his own career, right?
Exactly. He was a pragmatist for sure. He knew all the techniques. But crucially, unlike maybe some earlier orators who seemed to delight in rhetoric almost as art for art's sake, Demosthenes used his incredible mastery as a means to a far more important end. For him, that end was the preservation of Athenian democracy and freedom. Rhetoric was his weapon in that fight. It wasn't just performance. It had immense purpose.
A means to an end. That's a key distinction. But speaking of performance, what happened later? Our sources mentioned a kind of decay of eloquence. Did the art form decline?
That's a really critical point, yes. The later 4th century BC, and especially the Hellenistic, saw what contemporary and later critics definitely described as a decay of eloquence and a further, maybe negative ossification of rhetoric.
Why? What went wrong?
Well, the criticism was a growing subordination of content to form, style, delivery, cleverness. They started to overshadow substance.
Warm over function.
Pretty much the primary goal critics lamented. Often, it just became winning persuasion for the moment, scoring points, dazzling the audience, rather than any deeper moral conviction or serious political concern.
Sounds familiar, something?
Doesn't it? This led to speeches that were described quite harshly as compositions for the moment, the work of creatures with tongue but no brain.
Ouch.
Yeah, and sadly, this is maybe why very few Hellenistic speeches were actually preserved over time. They just lacked lasting significance or interest beyond their immediate context. It was as if, to use a metaphor from one source, the dry yellowish leaf of theory remained the rules, the system, but the green foliage of vibrant, meaningful practical application had withered away.
Wow, that's quite a trajectory. So, reflecting on all this, what does it all mean for us? We've journeyed through this incredibly dynamic world of ancient Greek rhetoric.
From Syracuse courts to Athenian assemblies.
From its pragmatic origins to its systematization into this powerful art and science, and its huge impact on education and intellectual life. We've met the Sophists, Aristotle, Lysias, Demosthenes.
Seen its rise and arguably a kind of decline into formalism.
So what's the big takeaway?
Well, I think what's truly remarkable looking back is that rhetoric at its best was a profoundly liberalizing force.
Liberalizing. How so?
It fundamentally demonstrated, maybe for the first time systematically, that there were two sides to many, if not all, questions. It forced people to consider opposing viewpoints, to argue rationally.
Laying the groundwork for debate and critical thinking.
Exactly. It laid crucial groundwork for humane law, for reasoned public discourse. That principle we still value, that even the wolf is entitled to plead in his own defense. As one commentator put it, that's a direct inheritance from Greek justice, deeply influenced by the Sophists' debates and the whole practice of public argument.
That's a really powerful legacy. And maybe it raises a final important question for you, our listener, to ponder. In our own modern world, absolutely saturated with information, with persuasion coming at us from everywhere all the time, how do we, as informed listeners, try to distinguish? How do we tell the difference between communication that genuinely aims for understanding, maybe for some kind of truth, and communication that seeks only to win persuasion for the moment, regardless of the facts or the consequences?
That's the challenge, isn't it?
What does it mean for our own ability to reason, to make good decisions, if the art of persuasion itself becomes the main goal, rather than just a means to achieving deeper understanding or finding common ground?
Yeah, something definitely worth thinking about as you navigate the constant flow of information out there.